Hello there, dear viewer, listener. I was going to respond to a few points Kenneth Brown made in his video, and a question again by Rens Wit about my opinion on climate change. And since I'm driving and not having much to do at the moment, I thought I'd get into that a little bit. Now, my opinion on climate change is so I'll tie this in with one of Kenneth Brown's points, which is the resources available to Europe and the West in general. And he makes a very good point that Europe isn't very resource rich, and one of the things it doesn't really have is energy resources. Oil, it does have some coal, especially in Britain and in Germany, but not enough. And coal liquefaction, as I've stated in previous videos, is not really an efficient means of gathering energy. It's not really an efficient replacement for oil. Nuclear power is, but that still has quite a lot of logistical issues in and of itself, especially with transportation. I'm in the energy business in a way, so I have to deal with power quite a lot, and power transportation and power transformation is still quite an issue even to this day. And scaling everything from oil to nuclear would require quite a lot of transformation of existing networks with huge investments. And that gets me into the whole climate thing, is that the investments the European Union is making with this energy transition has a lot to do with what Kenneth Brown has to say about resources, the lack of resources in Europe. That's they are trying to fix that by appealing to the general population with climate change, thus making sure that there's enough public support to invest billions upon billions, in fact trillions, into alternative energy sources, because, as Kenneth Brown also pointed out, we don't have uranium really either. So what's our options? Renewables in Europe. Now, renewables aren't really so renewable, and green energy isn't really so green as they all say, but there is actual possibilities with solar and wind to a certain extent. Not for extremely heavy industry, but you can make households energy independent with solar panels. Storage is a main issue, but you can still do quite a bit with solar and wind. Of course, biomass isn't really a realistic option, but it so requires, like I say, not just in the generation of power, in the building of solar panels and wind terminals. That takes quite a bit of power or money to build, to generate the power, but you also have the entire network that needs to be replaced, strengthened, all the transformator houses, the high energy cabling, the ground cabling. Most people's houses will have to have more power, incoming power, therefore requiring more modification of their fuse boxes, all these sorts of things, all requiring quite a lot of capital investment from both governments and private entities, businesses, and so on. So what do I think about climate change? Well, to an extent, climate change is about that. It's about trying to achieve energy independence for Europe, which has that geopolitical context that Kenneth argues as well, and also has the context of trying to be independent from Russia in terms of energy independence, energy generation, and takes care of dependence and one of the major issues, of course, for a modern economy, energy generation. So that's, I think, part of what climate change is. As for what the climate is, the climate actually changing? Yes, it is. Is it human influenced? Partially. I mean, certainly the whole point that distinguishes humanity from animals and so on is their capacity to reason, it's their capacity to influence the environment around them, and part of that is that we are capable of changing the environment in a negative way, not just positively. We can, of course, transform nature around us to generate more resources for us and therefore destroy the environment. Think of smog in China, smog in the 19th century and so on. Anyway, I have to park, do some stuff now, and I'll carry on later in a minute. Okay, now that I'm stopped for a bit, I'd actually like to clarify. I don't drive privately, I only drive for work. Currently at work waiting for something. I won't specify what actually. Probably not a good idea. Get myself doxxed. I actually got into politics through environmentalism. My mother was a bit of a new age hippie. My dad was a bit of a classical communist. So I've always kind of had this leftist politics from when I was young. When I was 16, I was quite a committed environmentalist and leftist. So that's my priors. I still care a lot about that. I'm still vegetarian. Still I still pay attention to ethical food products and so on. Don't consume too much. All this stuff, kind of Spartan lifestyle, all that. So do I believe in climate change? That's the question Rens Wit asked me. I think it's more interesting to talk about climate change as the political phenomenon, which is like what I said while I was driving, is more like a useful thing to get in agenda rolling, to get the people on side with the agenda. As for the actual matter of humans changing the environment, well, of course we can change the environment. We can change the landscape. The Netherlands is practically made by humans, after all. I mean, we turn a huge swamp into an actually productive area. Humans can turn barren plains to fertile grasslands, right? We can change the landscape. We can level mountains with dynamite, tunnel under the Alps. We can do all these sorts of things. So of course we can affect the environment in other ways as well. Now, do I think that CO2 and the stickstoff NOx issue that they've been harping on about is quite so significant as they make it all seem? No, because I think there are genuine problems created by people on the environment. Extinction of species, although I'm not really a very crying heart, so species get extinct because humans can't use them. That's just the order of things. We've made every species that's a threat to us extinct, or pushed them towards the edges. Like wolves, bears, they only live in Alaska, Siberia, places where they're not a threat to our civilization. We've killed them or made them, pushed them out of our territory. We do this with all animals. All the megafauna is dead because they were a threat to us. We hunted them to extinction. So in the end, the most successful species are those that we can use for our own purposes. Cows, sheep, pigs, chicken, these sorts of animals. They thrive alongside with us because we formed a symbiotic relationship of sorts with them. So, of course, we have an influence on the fauna, on the flora. What we do, for example, with plastic pollution in the oceans is a serious issue. But I don't really care about all this CO2 nonsense, because I think that they pick such a vague and intangible issue, even if it is legitimately an issue. I'm not going to dispute it may well be an issue. The greenhouse thing I'm not so sure about, but one thing that I've talked a lot about with a friend of mine is that the acidification of the oceans through CO2 is an actual issue for the continuation of the life of plankton and phytoplankton and so on, which of course destroys the entire food chain of the oceans, which would be an issue for us eventually as well. Oceans also absorb quite a lot of emission gases, produce quite a lot of oxygen and so on, so a healthy ocean is, we live in a closed system. Everything generates itself. A bit too big imbalance within the system is detrimental to the entire cycle. So there are genuine problems of human behavior, but they are quite measurable and tangible issues that you could focus on, which of course leftists, climate activists choose not to do. They choose to focus on these sorts of hard, intangible, difficult to popularize issues, because That way they never have to actually solve them. They never have to actually, you can't pull the general population into contributing, like you can't have them go and have mass actions to clean up like the sides of the motorways or something. These sorts of things are impossible if you keep it intangible enough. So that's why I think focusing on CO2 and so on is a bad idea. Instead, you should focus on what's in front of you and what you can do yourself and what's tangible, measurable. So first you should always, of course, adjust your own lifestyle, practice what you preach. That's the first thing, which a lot of leftists don't. Whenever I hear a lot of these, especially big companies, right? Companies preach all kinds of leftist morality, whether that be sexual or environmental or whatever, but they never, that's all just to get like a free pass on their actual unethical and poor behavior. And you just have to like throw some pro-LGBT stuff on your social media as a big company, and then the left suddenly doesn't want to criticize you anymore. And whenever the right-wingers call you out for being a lying hypocrite, just using the agenda to obfuscate things, then you're the one who's going to get attacked by leftist activists. In that way, that's why people say leftists are foot soldiers of the establishment, because the establishment can very easily co-opt them for their own agendas. And they very often don't practice. They preach. You will often see these public intellectuals and so on, and they'll talk about you shouldn't fly, don't go on holidays. Green Party politicians who then turn out to have a second house in another country, who go on holidays 3 times a year, or who go to like Thailand and Africa on holidays and so on. Even these leftists who do somewhat practice what they preach by going to do volunteering work in Africa are doing more harm than good most of the time. Firstly, by destroying the local economies, because throwing free stuff into a system doesn't improve it. And secondly, because traveling to Africa is just pollution. People should sort out their own issues, and if they can't sort out their own issues, it's better to let it go than to artificially keep things propped up. Things that shouldn't be allowed to live, things that are dying, things that are not capable of sustaining themselves should be allowed to die off for the general improvement of things. That's how evolution works. So, yes, climate change to an extent is real because human activity can influence the climate. Do we, as rightists, focus on it the same way? Should we focus on it the same way? Should we go on about CO2? No. I think we can cut the left off at the pass by focusing on actual tangible issues that people see in their day-to-day lives. Overconsumption, pollution. In the Netherlands, overconstruction. You see very little green areas because everything's being built full over here. These sorts of things, things that people deal with. Traffic, the huge amounts of traffic, which is something I never hear the left about. You want to solve all of these climate issues, well, a lot of that could be it has to do with, you have to localize and streamline your economy and your logistics. I keep hammering on this. You want to take care of quite a lot of pollution done by individuals, make sure that there's good mass transit, make sure there's good trains and trams and so on, things that allow people to avoid using cars and other such polluting things. Again, I only drive for work. I don't drive first. I always use a bicycle, or I take a train, which is quite feasible in the Netherlands because we've got fairly good public transportation. But even here, there's plenty of room to improve, right? But I think on the whole, the only reason this climate change agenda is allowed to thrive, and Kenneth is again right here, is because elites set the agenda, and the elites have taken up the agenda of climate change simply as a convenient means to get other issues through. In Europe and to an extent the United States, because we want energy independence away from the current system, which is reliance on Russia and the Middle East. If you were a sound policymaker in the United States, after this quagmire of 20 to 30 years in the Middle East, of these wars, and it is in part for oil, because you need energy security, you would want to find means to get away from oil from the Middle East as an energy source. Now, of course, they've done that temporarily by having shale gas, shale oil in the United States themselves, which is again very polluting, and it's not a very long-term solution. You can do that at a profitable ratio for maybe another 20 years. In that meantime, that's the thing. Peak oil is not just a meme fucking point. At some point there's peak oil. The whole thing is nobody can predict when, and the predictions up until now have always failed because you can make no accurate model because no one has an actual complete geological survey of the Earth. But there is still at some point the point of peak oil, which is not there is no more oil, but it's unprofitable to keep mining oil. That's the thing. You don't need to exhaust oil. You just need to make oil unprofitable to mine. So people are looking at alternative energy sources. That's what a lot of this green agenda is about, is finding ways to find support for alternative energy sources, which will cost a lot of time and money and investment from the society at large. But it will mostly be done by public funds, by taxes. And those countries who have, of course, nuclear as an option, such as the United States, will use that. Here in Europe, we don't have that option. So renewables is a great agenda to try to push the public, which is expensive but necessary. Being honest never gets you really anywhere in politics, because that's the thing with being a rightist is we're often too honest for our own good, because rightist politics are very harsh, very unsympathetic. It's we're not going to give help to those who are weaker and poorer, because those who are not capable of sustaining themselves shouldn't be sustained, and so on. These sorts of politics are harsh. Not everyone's welcome. There have to be limits. You know, there's a carrying capacity to the Earth. Overpopulation is an issue, and so on. And there's those points the left never addresses, which we should address: overpopulation, pollution in the third world, because the plastics in the ocean, the pollution, the emissions in the world are at this point mostly coming from India and China, to a lesser extent Vietnam, the Philippines, and so on, because that's where a lot of our heavy industry is now. Of course, that's our own fault to an extent, because we outsourced all of that industry over there. In a way, kind of, we abolished child labor in Europe and the West, and then we said, well, we'll just source our child labor from Asia then, because it's not like we eliminated child labor, it's more like we displaced child labor. And like we made industry and safety regulations here, but we kind of displaced unsafe industry to Asia then instead. It's not gone, it's just elsewhere, out of sight, out of mind in a way. Those are genuine issues. Not that I care particularly about the welfare about anyone in the third world, but it's still a planet we all share, and if they destroy it, we're still fucked as well. So focus on those things. So you want to talk about climate change. I don't know if that's really a good topic. If you were ever to be challenged by leftists to talk about climate change, what I would really choose to focus on would be sidestep them and say, what about overpopulation? Like every person added to the world is another person consuming. More consumption is the primary reason of the exhaustion of the planet, of the necessity to keep mining resources, to keep exploiting land, to overfarm and so on. All of these things. So that's my opinion on climate change, and I will elaborate more on Mr. Brown's points he made against me in another video. I'm still working some things out there because he's got an interesting perspective, and I need to rethink some things, because he like oversteps a lot of the sort of common talking points we have in the right, the sort of standard nationalist solutions to things. He has like, well, if you consider this and so on. So I think that's interesting. I'll get back to you later.